Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we uncover the darkest and most fascinating stories from American history. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story from the past. Today, we bring you a tale so disturbing, it challenges everything we know about family, genetics, and the human spirit of a 14-year-old bride to her own brother. Scientists feared the Bloodline's collapse. In 1987, the small, fog-choked hollows of Millfield, West Virginia, held secrets that most of the outside world could scarcely imagine. The land itself seemed to conspire in keeping them hidden. Narrow, winding roads that disappeared into thick woods, the constant low hum of cicadas, the chill that rolled down from the Allegheny Mountains like a whisper of warning. It was a place where neighbors spoke little of what they saw and even less of what they heard. Families stayed to themselves, bound together by history, hardship, and the stubborn pride of generations who had carved homes and lives out of the rock-hard earth. Among these families, none were more whispered about than the Thornwicks. They were not rich, not influential, and not the sort of people who ever traveled far. They were an old Appalachian clan whose roots dug so deep into the mountains that some claimed the family had been there since before the Civil War. Their homestead, a sprawling, weather-beaten farmhouse surrounded by acres of untamed forest, stood like a monument to endurance. But endurance in the Thornwick family came at a price. Evangeline Thornwick was born in the chill of a January morning in 1973, the third child of Harold and Millicent Thornwick. From the start, she was marked by an otherworldly fragility. Pale-skinned, with wide, liquid blue eyes and hair the color of ash, she carried an air of both innocence and something older than herself, a sense of history heavy upon her shoulders. Her childhood was quiet, watched over by her older brother Marcus, whose presence was both protective and suffocating. Marcus was 16 when Evangeline was 14, tall, wiry, and commanding in the way only a child raised in isolation could be. The Thornwicks were insular by design, believing that outsiders brought only corruption and misfortune. And in Millfield Hollow, isolation was a shield, but also a trap, the decision that would shock the outside world and terrify local medical professionals had been simmering for years, rooted in a twisted mixture of superstition and fear of outsiders. The Thornwicks, like many families in these parts, were deeply concerned with bloodlines. They had long believed that any dilution of their heritage could lead to weakness, disease, or the disappearance of their line entirely. Some said it was simple pride, a stubborn refusal to let strangers inherit what they had built. Others whispered of darker compulsions, of a need to cling to what was theirs at any cost. When Harold Thornwick announced that Evangeline would marry Marcus, the town recoiled. Local doctors were immediately called in, shaking their heads in disbelief and horror. The genetic risks are catastrophic, Dr. Leonard Hayes, a physician who had served the Hollows for decades, warned the family during a tense meeting in the parlor of the farmhouse. Incestuous unions of this degree almost always produce severe congenital defects. The likelihood of deformity, disease, even death, both of the child and mother, is extraordinarily high. But the Thornwicks, stubborn as the mountain rock around them, insisted that tradition and survival of their bloodline outweighed the warnings. Evangeline, barely 14, was aware of none of this. To her, the decision was simply a matter of family, her mother's gentle nudges, her father's grim nods, and her brother's protective but unyielding gaze made it all seem inevitable. In a culture where obedience was survival, questioning her fate was not an option. She did not yet understand the gravity of what was being asked of her, only that the world she had always known was shifting into something darker. The wedding was a quiet affair, held on a damp spring afternoon with the mist clinging to the edges of the porch and trees, as though the mountains themselves were watching. No outsiders were invited. The minister was a distant cousin who had reluctantly agreed to perform the ceremony, mumbling prayers under his breath. Evangeline wore a simple white dress, yellowed at the edges from storage, her hands trembling as she held Marcus's. He looked at her with a mixture of brotherly familiarity and something that unsettled even the oldest villagers who had come to witness it. There was no joy, no laughter, only the somber acknowledgement of what this union represented. It was not long after the ceremony that the first warnings from science began to echo louder in the family's ears. Dr. Hayes and a few other physicians in the nearby town attempted to intervene, visiting the Thornwick household multiple times to explain the risks in painstaking detail. They spoke of recessive genes, hereditary diseases, and the very real possibility that the family line would collapse under the weight of its own traditions. The Thornwicks listened with polite nods, but their eyes remained distant, unyielding. For them, the warnings were theoretical, abstract, distant as the town beyond the mountains. But as the months passed, a strange tension grew within the house. Evangeline began to experience symptoms doctors had predicted: fatigue that left her bedridden, persistent nausea, and an almost imperceptible pallor that made her look even younger than her 14 years. Marcus remained devoted, attending to her with a careful, almost clinical concern. Yet even he could not ignore the heavy atmosphere in the house, the quiet murmurs of neighbors, the shuffling of doctors who left with furrowed brows, and the sense that something fundamental was at stake. And then, in late November of 1987, the terror that no one could have anticipated began. The screams erupted at precisely 3:17 a.m., cutting through the still, frozen air like jagged glass. Mrs. Dorothy Kemp, the elderly telephone operator who had spent decades in Millfield Hollow, remembered it vividly. She had risen to answer a routine call, only to be frozen by the sound. It was not the scream of a single person. It was layered, primal, almost otherworldly, a cry that spoke of pain, fear, and a horror that went beyond human comprehension. The villagers awoke to an air heavy with dread. Those who ventured near the Thornwick farmhouse reported seeing shadows moving unnaturally, doors that swung open on their own, and the faint, unsettling echo of children's laughter where no children existed. Doctors arrived, again pleading for access, for permission to intervene, to understand what was happening inside that house. But the Thornwicks, bound by fear, pride, and something darker still, refused. The screams persisted, and by dawn, it was clear that the very foundation of the family had been shaken. What the doctors had feared most was unfolding before their eyes, but nothing could have prepared them for the true depth of the catastrophe. By mid-morning, a small group of neighbors, drawn by a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity, gathered at the edge of the forest that surrounded the house. They spoke in hushed tones, afraid that even mentioning the events aloud might summon something they could not name. Some claimed to see figures moving behind the curtains, too fast to be human. Others swore they heard whispered warnings and voices that were not entirely their own. And in the midst of it all, the mountain wind carried the faint scent of something metallic and acrid, a reminder that the horrors unfolding were as physical as they were psychological. Inside the farmhouse, Evangeline lay in her bed, trembling and soaked in sweat. Marcus knelt beside her, hands gripping hers with a desperation that was almost painful to witness. The doctors who had been allowed inside earlier that morning reported strange readings, vital signs that fluctuated wildly, eyes that seemed to reflect not just fear, but something alien, as if the very life force within the girl was struggling against a force no one could define. And then the first child was born. It was a boy, small and fragile, with a pallor that made him appear almost transparent. At first glance, he seemed normal enough, though doctors immediately noted irregularities subtle but alarming. His cries were weak, yet piercing, carrying a tone that seemed to echo the earlier screams in the night. Harold and Millicent, the parents, looked on with a mixture of awe and terror. They had survived the ceremony, the warnings, and the months of anxious waiting, but what they were witnessing now was something far more disturbing than mere genetics. The child's survival defied every expectation. According to medical science, a union like Marcus and Evangeline's almost never produced a viable offspring. And yet, here was life fragile, uncanny, and fundamentally altered. Dr. Hayes and his colleagues were perplexed, their professional pride clashing with a growing sense of dread. They had prepared for tragedy, for deformity, for the collapse of the bloodline. But this was something entirely new, something that did not fit the rules of biology they had spent decades mastering. As the days passed, the boy's development became a focal point of both fascination and horror. He grew faster than any infant in memory, his eyes unnervingly bright, and his expressions too deliberate for a child so young. Neighbors began whispering of unnatural intelligence, of glances that seemed to pierce the soul, and of small, inexplicable events around the house. Objects moving without contact, lights flickering, doors locking and unlocking on their own. The Thornwicks, once a family defined by isolation and secrecy, had now become the epicenter of something that no one in Millfield Hollow could explain. And, somewhere in the quiet shadows of the forest, as the sun set on the first full week after the birth, a sense of inevitability settled in. The doctors could advise, the neighbors could speculate, but no one could change what had begun. The Thornwick family had stepped beyond the bounds of ordinary life, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The very mountains seemed to hold their breath, as if aware that Millfield Hollow was about to witness a chapter of history that no textbook could capture. And no one alive would soon forget. Days turned into weeks, and the Thornwick farmhouse seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Inside, Evangeline struggled to recover from the birth. Her body weakened, but her mind increasingly haunted by a sense she could not name. Marcus never left her side, yet even his presence could not chase away the oppressive feeling that something had shifted in the very air they breathed. The child, whom they named Silas, was unlike any infant the doctors had ever encountered. He had survived the impossible, but survival was only the beginning. Dr. Hayes returned, reluctantly, several times. Each visit left him more unnerved. Silas's eyes, pale gray but unervingly intelligent, seemed to follow him across the room, tracking every movement. His cries carried a depth and cadence that made the hair on the back of the doctor's neck stand on end, as if he were listening not to a newborn, but to someone who had witnessed horrors beyond his understanding. Attempts to examine the child revealed anomalies in almost every measure: heart rate, reflexes, even the subtle ways his fingers and toes flexed. The medical instruments refused to reconcile his life with any known standard. Outside, the mountains whispered. Neighbors began to notice things they could not explain. Chickens vanished overnight, leaving only bloodied feathers behind. Dogs barked at shadows that dissolved when approached. Even the older children of the Hollows, who had grown up hardened by the isolation of these woods, avoided the Thornwick property after sunset. There were rumors that Silas could influence the animals, that trees seemed to lean toward the house in a way that defied natural growth. Some whispered that the boy was a living curse, others that he was a miracle, but no one dared draw too close for fear of being drawn into the Thornwick's dark orbit. Inside the house, the family began to fracture under the weight of their own secret. Millicent, the mother, oscillated between reverence and terror. She wanted to protect her children, but every night she lay awake listening to sounds she could not explain: footsteps when no one walked, whispers in empty rooms, and the unmistakable sense of someone or something watching. Harold, the father, became withdrawn, his hands trembling as he tended to the farm, unable to admit even to himself that the life he had fought to preserve was now beyond his control. Evangeline, still only 14, carried a deeper horror than anyone else. She had survived the birth, as had her son, but she felt a creeping emptiness within her, a shadow that clung to her very thoughts. Her dreams were no longer her own. They were filled with images of fire, blood, and unrecognizable figures moving just out of reach. Sometimes she would wake screaming, only to find Silas staring at her with those cold, calculating eyes, as if he understood something she did not, and perhaps never would. The doctors, meanwhile, were forced into a new role. What had begun as a medical observation had become a study in fear and impossibility. Dr. Hayes and his colleagues argued among themselves, some advocating for intervention, others warning that tampering might provoke something irreversible. They took blood samples, ran genetic tests, and found anomalies that defied explanation. Every chromosome, every marker, every single measure suggested a fragile genetic line, one that should have crumbled under the weight of incest and inbreeding. And yet, Silas lived, thrived even, his growth defying biology itself. As the weeks wore on, small tragedies began to pile up. First, a series of unexplained illnesses swept through the household, striking servants and animals alike. Then, one of the older Thornwick cousins vanished, leaving only a window swinging open in the dead of night. Local authorities found no evidence of foul play, yet the community whispered that the boy, this unnerving, unnatural Silas, was somehow responsible. The family spoke little, their faces tight with fear and resolve, and the Hollows settled back into silence, as if acknowledging that some things were too terrible to confront directly. Silas's intelligence grew at a pace that stunned and terrified those who dared to observe him. He began to speak in full sentences long before he was expected to, his voice carrying a cadence far older than his years. Doctors tested his cognitive development, finding patterns of reasoning and memory that were virtually unprecedented in children his age. Evangeline could only watch, torn between maternal love and the knowing realization that her child was no longer entirely human, or at least no longer constrained by human rules. Marcus, for his part, became protective to the point of obsession. He feared for his sister, for his child, and for himself. Yet even his vigilance was insufficient to prevent the growing influence of Silas. Objects shifted mysteriously around the house. Mirrors reflected images that didn't match reality. Sometimes, in the dim light of the parlor, it appeared as if Silas's shadow moved independently of his body. By late December, the Thornwicks themselves began speaking in hushed tones of forces they could not name, of warnings whispered in the wind, and of the fear that the family's stubborn insistence on bloodline purity had unleashed something beyond their control. Outside observers began to take note. Scholars from nearby universities, curious journalists, and a few brave locals attempted to understand what was happening. Each report carried a mixture of scientific curiosity and outright horror. Genetics experts tried to model the consequences of such an incestuous union, but every calculation failed when confronted with the reality of Silas. It was as if the natural laws themselves recoiled at the family's defiance, bending in ways that no textbook could explain. And yet, the community could not turn away completely. The Hollows, hardened by hardship and isolation, were drawn to the house in a mixture of fear and fascination. Some claimed to see Silas moving with uncanny purpose through the woods, shaping paths where none had existed. Others spoke of him speaking to animals, and even plants, with an authority that unsettled the most rational observers. Children who wandered too close were said to return shaken, speaking of cold eyes and voices that promised both knowledge and doom. By the start of 1988, it was clear that the Thornwick family had entered a realm beyond comprehension. Evangeline's health remained fragile, Marcus's mind was taut with anxiety, and Silas grew stronger with every passing day. The doctor's warnings had been only a prelude to the horror unfolding. What they had predicted, collapse of the bloodline, illness, death, was not what was happening. Instead, something else, something far more unpredictable, was taking root. And in the dead of the winter nights, when the wind cut through the hollows like a blade, and the snow lay thick upon the mountain, the house seemed alive in ways that could not be explained. Whispers echoed from empty hallways, shadows moved without source, and the boy's presence became a gravitational force, drawing the attention, fear, and curiosity of everyone within sight. The boundaries of science, morality, and reason had all been crossed, and no one in Millfield Hollow, or perhaps anywhere in the world, could have predicted what was coming next. By the time winter fully gripped Millfield Hollow, the Thornwick farmhouse had become a fortress of unease. Snow lay heavy on the mountains, muting the sounds of the world, but inside the house, the air was thick with dread and whispered secrets. Evangeline could no longer distinguish between her own thoughts and the impulses that seemed to emanate from Silas. His presence was magnetic, drawing her in with a quiet intensity that left her both enthralled and terrified. Marcus, once the unshakable protector, began to show cracks. His nights were sleepless, haunted by images of impossible things, and even he could not ignore the strange phenomena that had become routine. Doors that slammed without wind, reflections in mirrors that moved contrary to reality, and shadows that clung to corners like living things. Silas grew at a speed that defied logic. By the second winter of his life, he could walk with a cautious but deliberate gait, his small frame moving with the precision of someone much older. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried a weight that belied his age, echoing through the halls and leaving even the most rational adults unsettled. Local children, drawn by curiosity and fear, whispered of glimpses of the boy wandering through the woods, speaking in voices that sounded like their own parents or siblings, coaxing them toward the dark edges of the forest. No one could explain it, and the community began to fear that the Thornwick homestead was no longer simply a home, but a nexus of something unnatural. Inside, tension reached a breaking point. Evangeline, still fragile from the birth and weakened by constant worry, began experiencing vivid visions that seemed to connect her to Silas in ways that were impossible. She would wake screaming from dreams of the future, seeing things that had not yet happened, and sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, she could hear Silas whispering her name in tones she had never taught him. Her mother, Millicent, tried to comfort her, but even she admitted in private to Harold that the child was no ordinary boy, and that the family might have unleashed forces they could not control. Outside world could not remain entirely ignorant. Dr. Hayes and a small team of physicians returned repeatedly, driven by scientific curiosity that had grown into something darker, fear. Each examination revealed anomalies so profound that the team could not document them without admitting they had no explanation. Silas's growth rate was abnormal, his intelligence far surpassing what would be expected of a child his age, and the subtle manipulations of the household objects moving. Unexplained sounds defied physics and reason. Attempts to isolate the phenomena failed. No camera, no recording device could capture the events reliably. And yet, those who spent enough time in the house left with a gnawing unease, as if the air itself were imbued with a sentience they could not understand. Then, as February settled into the mountains, the first real tragedy struck. One of the neighbors, a man named Jeremiah Collier, who had ventured too close to the house in defiance of warnings, vanished without a trace. His family swore they heard Silas's voice calling him into the woods in the dead of night. A search found only footprints leading toward the dense forest, and then abruptly stopping as though swallowed by the earth itself. Panic rippled through Millfield Hollow. No one had seen anything like it. Fear turned to superstition, and whispers spread of a curse that had descended on the Thornwick household. Marcus and Evangeline were caught between terror and pride. They had insisted on preserving the bloodline, believing they were safeguarding their family's future. But now they questioned whether they had instead sown the seeds of destruction. Evangeline's health continued to decline, and she often found herself staring at Silas, trying to reconcile the love she felt for her child with the mounting fear that he was something else entirely. Marcus, once a rock of certainty, began pacing the halls at night, muttering to himself, his hands shaking as he tried to keep control of the chaos around him. The child's influence extended beyond the physical house. Animals in the area behaved erratically, drawn to the farmhouse in unnatural ways. Dogs barked and fled, cats crouched with arched backs, and birds avoided the skies above. Even the weather seemed affected. Sudden gusts of wind, unexpected blizzards, and unexplained temperature drops became routine around the Thornwick property. Local residents spoke in hushed tones of an invisible force radiating from the home, as if the child's presence was rewriting the rules of nature itself. By early spring, Silas had begun to manipulate the household in more alarming ways. Doors would lock and unlock on their own. Objects would appear in locations that defied logic, and even Marcus admitted to hearing voices in his head, not his own thoughts, but commands in Silas's tone. Evangeline, at times, felt compelled to obey, powerless against the unseen influence radiating from her son. The doctors were at a loss. Every attempt at observation, every test or intervention, only reinforced the idea that the family's choices had created something that defied understanding, a living anomaly that blurred the lines between science, nature, and something far darker. The psychological strain on the family grew unbearable. Evangeline began speaking in fragmented sentences about visions she could not explain. She described landscapes she had never seen, people she had never met, and events that had not yet occurred. Marcus tried to ground her in reality, but he, too, felt the pull of Silas's presence, as if the child was a gravitational force, bending their perceptions, their fears, and their will. At night, the air inside the farmhouse was thick, almost tangible, vibrating with an energy that left the walls humming and the floorboards quivering underfoot. By midsummer, the outside world could no longer ignore the Thornwicks. A small contingent of state investigators arrived, cautiously surveying the property after reports of unexplained disappearances and disturbances. They noted strange markings in the snow, footprints that led nowhere, and sounds that could not be accounted for. Their attempts to approach the house were met with sudden, inexplicable phenomena. Doors slamming, windows rattling, and lights flickering without cause. The team left shaken, some claiming that the house itself was alive, that the boy at its center radiated a presence beyond comprehension. And yet, despite everything, Silas continued to thrive. His mind developed with terrifying speed, and with it came a growing mastery over the world around him. The family watched in a mix of awe and horror as the boy exhibited behaviors that no human child could, solving problems, predicting events, and demonstrating awareness far beyond his years. It became increasingly clear that the Thornwicks' decision to marry siblings had not destroyed their bloodline. It had created something new, something unprecedented, something that the world was not prepared to encounter. By late summer, the house had become a place of both wonder and terror. Locals would speak of glimpsing silhouettes in the windows at dusk, of hearing laughter that carried no warmth, and of fleeting glimpses of a boy whose presence seemed to warp reality. Inside, the family was trapped in a web of fear, love, and confusion. Evangeline's dreams continued to connect her to Silas in ways that were both intimate and horrifying. Marcus, once a pillar of strength, now clung to his sister and son with a desperation that revealed just how fragile he had become. The mountains themselves seemed to acknowledge the change. Trees leaned toward the farmhouse, birds avoided its shadow, and the wind carried whispers that sounded almost like warnings. Dr. Hayes, witnessing the progression, realized that the Thornwicks were no longer simply a family. They were the epicenter of something that defied science, morality, and human understanding. The child, born of an unthinkable union, had become something more than human, a force that threatened to reshape the very nature of the world within which he existed. By the fall of 1988, the Thornwick farmhouse had become something the people of Millfield Hollow spoke of in whispers, a place simultaneously feared and irresistibly compelling. The mountains around it were silent witnesses to the unnatural events that seemed to radiate from within. Evangeline's health had deteriorated further. She moved like a ghost to her own home, her once bright eyes now shadowed with exhaustion and terror. Marcus, though still fiercely protective, had become gaunt and jittery, his mind unraveling under the relentless pressure of living in a house that no longer obeyed the ordinary laws of nature. Silas had grown perceptibly stronger and more aware. At just over 3 years old, he could manipulate objects without touching them, coax animals into eerie obedience, and most unsettling of all, appear to bend people's perceptions with a glance. Those who approached the house reported an almost magnetic pull, a feeling that drew them closer, even as fear churned in their stomachs. Inside, the air was heavy, saturated with the tension of something waiting to fully reveal itself. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight, every whisper of wind seemed imbued with a sense of imminent revelation. It was on a cold November night, under a sky darkened by clouds heavy with snow, that the full horror of the Thornwick's choice came to light. Evangeline awoke to a sensation she could not describe, a tremor running through her body, the kind that carried both warning and inevitability. She stumbled to Silas's room and found him standing by the window, gazing out at the mountains with an intensity that made her shiver. His small hand lifted, and the door swung open as if pushed by an invisible force. Objects in the room trembled, and she realized, with a pang of dread, that the house itself responded to his will. Marcus arrived moments later, calling for his sister, but the sound of his voice seemed muted, distant, as if underwater. He found Silas at the center of the parlor, small yet impossibly commanding, surrounded by objects that had floated and twitched in eerie unison. Dr. Hayes, summoned in desperation, had also arrived, but he recoiled at the scene, his professional detachment shattered by fear. The boy's eyes glowed faintly in the candlelight, pale gray transforming into something unnatural, something that seemed to contain the knowledge of centuries. Then the unthinkable happened. Silas began to speak, his voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to warp the air around him. He uttered a series of statements that defied explanation, predicting events in the town beyond the mountains, recounting secrets that no one outside the house could have known, and issuing warnings that chilled the hearts of everyone present. The house trembled, walls vibrating as if echoing the power radiating from the child. Evangeline sank to her knees, clutching Marcus, knowing in her bones that the future she had tried to protect had been forever altered. Outside, the winds howled through the hollows. Lights flickered across the mountaintops, and shadows danced unnaturally among the trees. Neighbors who had gathered at a safe distance witnessed a faint, luminous glow emanating from the farmhouse, accompanied by the echo of screams, laughter, and whispers layered atop each other in a terrifying chorus. The mountains themselves seemed to respond, trees bending toward the house, branches clawing at the sky as if drawn by the presence within. In the days that followed, the full scope of the family's miscalculation became undeniable. Silas's development accelerated beyond comprehension. He displayed knowledge of science, history, and human behavior that no child should possess. Yet there was a cold, calculating element to it, a subtle manipulation of everyone around him. Evangeline, once the hopeful mother, became a silent observer, trapped between love and horror, understanding that the child she had borne was the living embodiment of both their lineage and their doom. Marcus, too, began to falter, the weight of responsibility crushing him. The knowledge that he had helped bring this into the world, knowing it his very soul. Local. Authorities eventually attempted intervention, but even the most rational officers reported bizarre phenomena. Tools lifted into the air without hands, lights that defied wiring, and the sensation that the house itself was a living organism reacting to their presence. No laws of physics, no rules of genetics, and no logic could account for the events. The scientists who visited were forced to admit that the Thornwick bloodline had not collapsed as they feared, but neither had it followed any known pattern of human existence. It had transformed into something entirely new, something beyond understanding, something terrifying. By the end of the year, Millfield Hollow itself had changed. The mountains around the Thornwick property were avoided by hunters and travelers alike. Children were warned to stay far from the house, and even the bravest adults spoke of unease and dread when in its shadow. The Thornwicks had become a legend, whispered about around fireplaces and in hushed conversations. At church, an echo of horror that mingled with curiosity and superstition. Silas remained at the center of it all, a living testament to the consequences of pride, isolation, and the defiance of nature's laws. Evangeline and Marcus survived, but the cost was etched into their bodies, their minds, and their spirits. They had hoped to preserve a family line, to protect their blood from outside influence, but what they had done was far greater and far darker than they could have anticipated. They had created a child whose existence challenged everything humanity understood about genetics, morality, and the natural order. And as they watched him grow, guiding the movements of the household, bending the world to his will, they understood the terrible truth. Survival alone was not a victory. It was the beginning of a legacy whose consequences would echo through generations, a story of life, horror, and a bloodline that refused to die, but also refused to remain human. Millfield Hollow would never forget the Thornwicks. The screams, the whispers, and the shadows of the past became part of the folklore of the mountains, a cautionary tale of obsession, tradition, and the dark curiosity that can arise when humans tamper with the natural order. And in the house, beyond locked doors and reinforced windows, Silas Thornwick stood at the center of it all, a child of impossible birth, a testament to the extremes of human pride, and a reminder that sometimes, in seeking to preserve life, we awaken forces that cannot be contained. The mountains endured, silent and eternal, bearing witness to a family's choices, a child's unnatural brilliance, and a bloodline that defied the expectations of doctors, scientists, and nature itself. The story of Evangeline, Marcus, and Silas would pass into legend, not because of happiness, or triumph, or simple survival, but because of the terror, the wonder, and the haunting truth that some secrets are too powerful to remain hidden, and some legacies are too dangerous to be forgotten.